Small town street corner, words exchanged, a fight breaks out and someone dies. It's not exactly common, but it rarely makes national news. Tonight, though, there is a national outcry over the verdict in a small town case with explosive racial overtones. Latino leaders in eastern Pennsylvania today telling CNN they're going to push for federal charges against two young white men acquitted, on Friday night of killing a Mexican immigrant. Was it a hate crime or simply a brawl that turned deadly? And should what is said during a crime be a crime in its own right? A discussion shortly, but first the facts of the case. Soledad O'Brien tonight, Uncovering America.
Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, a small coal mining town of 6,000 people nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, a place that's never garnered much attention until now. In July 2008, Luis Ramirez, a 25-year-old undocumented immigrant from Mexico and father of two, was beaten to death by a group of white teenagers.
The people united!
Turning this town into an unlikely flashpoint in the national debate over immigration and racism. It all began on this street corner, where a middle-of-the-night encounter turned into a melee. Prosecutors say Ramirez was called a spick and other epithets. He was kicked and punched until he was unconscious. 2 days later, Ramirez was dead. Luann Pleva, who grew up in Shenandoah, was horrified.
It was unthinkable. How could kids do this? How could kids who were raised in my hometown do this?
Following the attack, 4 teenagers were arrested. One is on trial in juvenile court. 3 others, high school football standouts Derek Donchak, 19, and Brandon Pekarski and Colin Walsh, both 17, were charged as adults. Donchak was accused of aggravated assault, Pekarski and Walsh of third-degree murder. All 3 were charged with ethnic intimidation, a hate crime in Pennsylvania. All pleaded not guilty, saying Ramirez was an active participant in a street fight that went horribly wrong. Colin Walsh's father, Michael, said last year his son's a good kid.
He has straight A grades. I never had a problem with Colin, or I don't believe any of these other boys are in trouble either.
State prosecutors later dropped charges against Walsh when he pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations. He then testified in court against his friends, saying racial slurs were used in the attack. An all-white jury of 6 men and 6 women convicted Donchak and Pekarski of simple assault.
In my mind, it was the lack of evidence to tie these kids to these serious charges that they brought.
The prosecutor accepted the verdict.
The jury has rendered their verdict, and they took a long time and deliberated on the case, and we respect their verdict.
But the verdict has enraged proponents of Latino rights.
In this case, the message is that a person who may not be popular in society based on their national origin or a certain characteristic has less value in our society.
While some may think this depressed coal town is an incubator of fear and intolerance, the truth is much more complicated. Shenandoah is very proud of its diversity. People whose families come from Lithuania and Poland live alongside Puerto Ricans and Mexicans. Many residents feel overwhelmed by all the attention, and they say they've gotten a bum rap.
They have these vigils. It's everybody from out of town. They just want them to go away. We just want to get on with our lives.
Yet many locals told us there are racial tensions, and the case has cast a pall over the town. Before the verdict, we spoke with Luis Ramirez's girlfriend, the mother of his children. She was hopeful that the young men would be found guilty on every charge. When we reached out to her after the verdict to comment on this story, she declined out of fear for her safety. Soledad O'Brien, CNN, Shenandoah, Pennsylvania.
Let's dig deeper now with senior legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin and John Amaya of the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Jeff, did the verdict surprise you?
Well, you know, hate crimes are hard to prove because they're not just about proving an assault. You have to prove the intent of the person. You have to prove why someone committed a crime. In most criminal prosecutions, you don't have to prove why. You simply have to prove that they did it. And here, they had to prove that this was done out of ethnic hatred, and that's tougher for prosecutors, and the jury didn't buy it.
John, you believe this was a hate crime, though?
Absolutely. There's no question in our mind. The individuals who testified, who took part in the brutal beating, they themselves said that this was a result of their bias against Luis for the fact that he was a Mexican And so in our mind, the evidence was there. We are just really appalled and outraged by this result, because what this does is it sends a message to certainly Shenandoah Latino residents, but residents around the country, that if you're Latino and you're brutally beat, there's no justice for you.
We're going to have more with our panel just after this short break. Also ahead tonight, the justices and Janet Jackson, the Supreme Court actually weighing in on, remember that wardrobe malfunction? That's what they called it? Well, what the order said and why it could have far-reaching consequences on indecency. And stepping out of the White House at his date night for President Obama and Michelle Obama, what they did and where they went and how successful it was to getting away from all the reporters and Secret Service and stuff like that, we'll tell you ahead on 360. We're talking about the beating death of a Mexican immigrant and the acquittal by an all-white jury of 2 young men charged with beating him to death while shouting ethnic slurs. Back now with senior legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin and John Amaya of the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Jeff, you were talking about intent and motive and bias before the break. If while someone is being attacked, if the attackers are using ethnic slurs, does that not indicate some level of bias?
Absolutely. In fact, that's usually the best evidence you have as a prosecutor that a hate crime is taking place. And that's what the prosecution put forward in this case, as I understand it. The problem is the jury, for whatever reason, didn't believe that that had taken place, so they acquitted him. But yes, that's the best evidence usually you can have.
And Jeff, does that automatically mean, I mean, do words equal hate crime? I mean, if you use certain words, that equals a hate crime?
Well, often that they do. I mean, there are other ways of proving a hate crime. You can prove, for example, planning. If you can find a group of people that talked about, we're going to go out and get some member of an ethnic group, and then they do it, even if they don't use slurs at the time, that can be evidence of a hate crime. There are a variety of ways to prove it, but it all winds up in front of a jury, and you got to persuade the jury.
John, is there any evidence that this was some sort of predetermined plan?
Well, I don't know that there was evidence that there was a predetermined plan, but certainly there was plenty of evidence by individuals who took part in the beating that they went after and instigated Luis. They are the ones.
But the jury didn't buy that, though. Why do you think that was?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Always a trial is going to be in the jury, in the hands of the jury, and the problem that we could foresee in this was bias, because from the very, very beginning you had local city officials who were publicly pardoning these quote-unquote good old boys that they could not imagine these particular boys coming from certain families doing such a heinous crime. And so we were very concerned, and we certainly pushed for a change of venue because of this very reason, because we felt there would be bias. And lo and behold, now we're hearing that the jury foreman is mentioning that there was racial biases in the deliberation.
How has he said that? Jeff, or what were your
I was just going to say, the facts and circumstances of this case certainly call for at least a federal investigation, because it is possible when a group of individuals are acquitted on state charges that federal bias charges can be brought. That doesn't count as double jeopardy. The most famous example, of course, was the Rodney King case. After the cops were acquitted in state court, they were eventually successfully prosecuted in federal court, and many people in the community are calling for a federal investigation here, and it sure seems like at least an investigation is called for, if not a prosecution.
And John, that's what you want as well?
Absolutely. We are in complete support of the Department of Justice coming forward with a thorough and complete investigation, top to bottom, not just of the incident, but the actions that took place subsequent to the beating on through the trial. We think this is outrageous, it's egregious, and that's what the civil rights laws are in place for. This is well within the means and the authority of the federal government and the Department of Justice to come in and seek justice out for Luis and his family.
All right, we'll continue to follow. John and I appreciate your time. Jeff Toobin as well. Thanks.